Hello and welcome to the third video of this series, The City Upon a Hill, Pilgrims, Puritans and the Promised Land. As you know, if you have watched the previous videos, I'm Kata, and those are my summary videos for the tutorial to the Introduction to North American Cultural Studies at TU Dresden in the winter term 2025-2026. The learning goals for today are to understand who those Pilgrims and Puritans are, what they have to do with American history, what they experienced when they came to America, and also how their religious myth of the so-called Promised Land became a national myth, and how important this and the related tropes are still today in US culture. The keywords that will play a role are Calvinism, wasps, not the insects, the Promised Land, and the first Thanksgiving. Let us start with the question of who are the Puritans and Pilgrims and why are they important? Here are some hard facts. Basically, we have two religious groups. Pilgrims and Puritans, both coming to the Americas in the 17th century, the Pilgrims first in 1620 on the, or maybe not only on that ship, they had many ships, but on the flagship Mayflower, led by William Bradford, and then the Puritans coming 10 years later on a fleet led by the flagship Arbella and led by John Winthrop. Both religious communities and both actually founded a city, even though the Pilgrims were not supposed to do so. They actually were supposed to land in Virginia, which they didn't. We don't know if it's on purpose. It might well be on purpose because founding an own city, that basically enables them to lead their life the way they wanted. And so they founded Plymouth, and they actually lived peacefully with the indigenous population for at least a while. The Puritans, however, founded Boston, and they experienced trouble both internally and with the natives from the very beginning, as main idea of whom are we dealing with. They are both coming from Europe in the 17th and also 16th century, and it's, I think, important to have a little bit of background knowledge on Europe and religion at that time. So basically, what we can say is Protestantism is on the rise. We formerly had the Pope and the Catholic Church as the main religious, like, institution and also like the authority that could say everything about religion. And now Martin Luther in Germany translates the Bible. Henry VIII, the king with the 6 wives in England, says, I want to divorce my first wife, and thus I break with the Catholic Church and found the Anglican Church, where I am head of state. And also Calvin, another theologist, has some theories on the Bible, and yeah, so those are like some examples of Protestantism. And each group has in common that they challenge the Pope, and especially Luther and Calvin only accept God and the Bible as a religious authority. We could say those are religious culture wars if we want it that way. And the consequence is that we have religious refugees all over the place, because in England, for example, Henry VIII may have been Protestant, but his daughter, Bloody Mary or Queen Mary I, was not Protestant, but she was Catholic and basically made Catholicism the main religion in England again. A few years later, she died, and her sister Elizabeth, who was then Queen Elizabeth I, comes on the throne, a Protestant, and now it's all reverted. And so that's quite difficult for the population there, and we have religious refugees, for example, the Pilgrims and Puritans, who go somewhere else. They also went to the Netherlands first and then went to the Americas just in order to be able to live their life and their religion as they wanted and not basically under threat of the state or the king all the time. Now, what is important here is that Calvinism as a theory was more or less incorporated into the Anglican Church insofar as that we have some congregations that follow Calvinist theories, and those are then the Pilgrims and Puritans, for example, within the Anglican Church. And they're also in disagreement with the Anglican Church, which led to them going somewhere else. Well, where did they go? They went to the Americas, and they were not terra nullius, as we have explored in the last video. We basically had Columbus arriving, and even he didn't arrive on a empty space, but he arrived on a place and a land where basically things had happened before. And for the area we're talking about today, which is the Massachusetts Bay Area, it is important to know that there had been fights among the native tribes for a while. And this is also something that features when we look into what happened to the Pilgrims and Puritans there. They also, so the native tribes, had had numerous encounters with Europeans. They were not unknown to them, and they had experienced the diseases and also some intercultural exchange. And some, and this is very important now, also knew English as a communicative means. Some even had been to England. So we don't have a naive population and a first encounter here, but something where we have a background. Now, what happened in 1620? The Pilgrims arrive. We have a key text from the period, William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, that depicts, at one hand, the hopes and doubts about the new life, but also the experiences the pilgrims make there. They also, and that's important, have the so called Mayflower Compact as a founding document, and that is basically a contract that states that all those settlers, at least the male guys who come there, they agree to not kill each other, live in community, and also deal with the matters that they have to deal with. So anything that would basically be done by the state nowadays, the government, that they do all that on their own. That they don't really take orders from the king and do what the people in England expect from them, but that they will basically have their own congregation and their own society in a way, which is very important because it's one first step towards independence. They come very late in the year, and this means that they survive their first winter there not because they are so superbly able to, but actually because the indigenous people help them. Um, they are like some people from the local tribes come to them and support them, offer their help, and that is then basically what is the basis of the first Thanksgiving, which is 1 year later when they celebrate together that they have survived the winter, and that is basically the beginning of this peaceful period with the local tribe. Um, One question that is important here is, whom did the settlers thank? Did they thank God? Did they thank the natives? I think it's quite clear they, of course, thanked God and didn't really think that the natives were those who actually had made them survive, but they were rather like, God grants us his blessing, and because of that, the natives helped us. What is also interesting here is that the natives did not actually just help them because of hospitality and because they wanted to be nice, but actually because of what we have heard about the fights in the Massachusetts Bay Area. It was very important to have allies. And now, this very people that helped them had the possibility of forming an alliance with the Pilgrims, and then they basically protected each other. So it was not really was it really a pragmatic decision to have contact and help each other rather than just being friendly. Now, what is also interesting here is portrayals of the first Thanksgiving. And if you want to take a moment, then have a look at those paintings and use your knowledge, describe those pictures, and ask yourself, what does it tell us about the perception of the event of the first Thanksgiving in US American culture? Those pictures both were not painted in the 17th century, but are both from 1915. So we can also already think about that as well. So it's a first Thanksgiving, and it's very important, even though it was years and centuries before. But now I don't want to spend more time on that, but rather have a look at the Puritans. Those are the guys who arrived 10 years later, and they saw America as their promised land, where they would find or found a new Jerusalem. And then we have this important City Upon a Hill speech by John Winthrop, where basically he says that we will be an example for all the other people, and we will just found this like wonderful city upon a hill. They experienced a lot of difficulties because they had internal disagreement, and also the struggle of the tribes they landed in really hit them in the face. What is important here is that we already had theological disputes, and then we have this very prominent image of John Winthrop and the Puritans, and with him as a so-called looming figure in administration, policing, and gatekeeping, and also this idea that the Puritans weren't actually happy because they were basically afraid of the idea that anyone anywhere could be happy. So it was a very earnest and stern and hard-working, but certainly not happy, religious community. And it's also important to have a look at what they interpret their military success and the death and destruction of others. In that case, the native tribes, because that meant that they could have more land. They interpret it as God has faith in us, similar to the Pilgrims before. Basically, they didn't really see it as, okay, we did something, but rather God has faith in us, and because of that, we can just continue to live the way we do. Now, let's sum that up. Why are those Puritans and Pilgrims important, and who are they? They're basically both groups of religious separatists that come from England and founded cities. They came in 1620, 1630, respectively, and they both had this idea of the promised land, high hopes, and then experienced deep struggles. And they have so called mythical consequences. We talked about the myth in some video before, and a myth is basically usually important to the nationalist foundation of a nation. It basically is a story of the beginning that is intermingled with truth and not so true events, and basically what people refer to as the beginning of a, for example, nation. And here we have the first Thanksgiving and also the City upon the Hill speech, which will have very much real life consequences later. So let's look at those consequences. Mainly the myths that then later develop into American exceptionalism. And here we will have a look at a cultural text first. This is an excerpt from John Winthrop's sermon that he gave on the board of the Arabella before the Puritans even arrived in America. And this is a very, very pivotal speech in US culture. And you can have a look at the excerpt I gave you here and think about what expectations do they have. Is it a warning, but also a promise maybe? And also, this is a very, very frequently cited speech in then later speeches in American culture, and also the basis of American exceptionalism, because what John Winthrop says here is that they will be like a so-called city upon a hill. So basically, everybody will look up to them and see them as an example. And here in that excerpt, he basically says, well, if we don't reach that goal and if we fall from faith, then we will be a very bad example, and everybody will hear of that, and everything will just fall apart. But it also is, in a way, a promise, because it means that if we don't do that, but actually succeed in having a Christian community here, then we will be a very, very influential part for all over the world, and we will be a great example. And basically, also that they are the exceptional people who can do that. So this is very important here. And this is also a very regional myth at first. It's the idea of the promised land with biblical origin, and then also the Thanksgiving as a very biblically tied thing, because of course, whom do you thank in Thanksgiving in the beginning? It's thanking God that he made they made everything possible. This myth is present with both Puritans and Pilgrims, and so we can also say it's a regional northern myth if we look at the later emerging US. And it's the beginning of American exceptionalism, because this biblical notion is used by President Lincoln in 1863 amidst the Civil War in the US to take a stance, because he introduces Thanksgiving as a national holiday and thus prioritizes the northern founding myth over the South US. He also creates a hierarchy of religion, of Protestantism over Catholicism, and he prioritizes the northern abolitionist stances, so also a political idea. In the South, slave trade and having slaves on the plants and plants was having slaves care for example, agriculture was extremely common. And now in the North, this was thought of as, well, not that ideal. So you had this abolitionist idea. And if on the case in the moment that Lincoln basically said we use those foundational myths, he also prioritized those abolitionist ideas. And now this national myth then was taken up frequently later as well. And here I have some examples from presidential speeches. This is a Kennedy speech from 1961, where he says, or he refers to John Winthrop, and then he says, our governments in every branch, at every level, national, state, and local, must be as a city upon a hill. So basically this idea of we have to be exceptional, and we are able to do that. Later, Ronald Reagan also uses those ideas. This is his farewell to the nation, and he says that he thought a bit about the shining city upon a hill, and in a way has spoken of America or the US as this city upon a hill for all his political life. And then also describes what he sees it as, and you can see that this is a very maybe different image from what the Puritans have wanted, because I mean the Puritans didn't really want happiness, they just wanted their religion to be everything in their world. It's very different now, but still it's this idea of a city upon a hill as an example of exceptionalism in a way. Then later, Obama used it, and this is not a presidential speech insofar as that he wasn't president, but this is a graduation speech at Massachusetts University. And here he speaks to the people from other nations, people who are international students, and also Americans with histories that are not European, but rather African, Hispanic. Okay, Hispanic is also tied to Europe, but also Asian, Arab American. And then he says that basically they came to the Americas believing, like those first settlers, that they could find a home in the city on a hill. So again, we have America and the US as an exceptional place where people can come to, where they can find a very good life. And then, of course, the current President Trump also uses this. He doesn't refer to John Winthrop like that straightforwardly, but he says that the US shine as an example. And this is basically also this idea of the city upon a hill, just in like less referencing terms. What is also important to ask here is, I think, it is a national myth for whom? Mainly for the so-called WESPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, because it's always referred to the history of them and also to religion as a reason for what do you do here. But this national myth never went uncriticized. We do have early criticism by Nathan Hawthorne, for example, with his novel The Scarlet Letter, where he describes a Puritan village and also the grim reality there. And he basically says, well, it's not at all that wonderful to have this foundational myth, but he really criticizes it very harshly. And in the end, the hero in that book, who is a single mother who has faced very much trouble in the religious community, because of course she's unmarried, she has a child out of marriage and everything, that woman who has been deprived for all the novel then goes and founds a new life somewhere else. So she basically has this individualist idea and also that exceptional idea of I as an individual can just make my way. We also have the importance of the so-called transatlantic slave trade. So basically slaves having come from the ages of as early as Columbus to the US or to the Americas. And those people, of course, do have a very different idea of what a national myth or a foundational myth for America should be for them, because they have made completely different experiences. Also, the indigenous perspectives on, for example, Thanksgiving or this exceptionalism idea, they do matter. What is, however, interesting is that the civil rights movement also used this promised land myth and basically took it out of context. But those are some aspects that we maybe should consider in cultural studies if we really want to have a fully fledged picture of this national myth and the consequences. So let's sum that up. We do have this exclusionary foundational myth, which is important because it is cited everywhere, and we have the frequent use of those tropes in presidential speeches and also the self-perception of the nation. But this is an exclusionary perspective because it is, of course, the perspective of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, of Europeans, and not of the whole population in America. It's also a northern perspective that is the basis of nationalist exceptionalism. But what about the other perspectives? That is an important question. And with that, I would maybe like to have a creative task for you. This doesn't mean that you have to send me anything. It's just like something you could think to do. You could choose one of the events from this session. Think what might be a person, so choose one, who was not a WASP that reported about this event, and how would they maybe have reported about this event from their perspectives. Maybe you can write a short report. Of course, this would also be always just be fictional and also limited by what you know from this other perspective, just to really have an idea and also try to see things differently than from the hegemonic idea. Now, with that, I thank you for your participation, and you can send me an email. And I don't see you next week because this is from the tutorial slide. Sorry. But if you are a tutorial student watching that video, I will see you next week. But yeah, thanks for the participation. If you have any questions, you can always ask them or drop me a comment. And here is a little bit of selected bibliography and further reading. Those are, of course, not the only sources I used, but I think those are two that can be of importance for you and maybe are just interesting. Thank you very much.